Welcome back to Sika Strength and welcome back to Sika Stan Reacts. Today's new show. Welcome back to Sika Stan. Welcome back to Sika Strength. Today's new show was brought to you. Jesus Christ. Welcome back to Sika Strength and welcome back to Sika Stan. Today's Coaches React, S&C Coaches React is of course brought to you by the Sika Strength app on iOS and Android for all of your strength and conditioning needs. If you're not aware, there's been conditioning programs added to the app recently and more will be added in the near future. Now today's reaction is on Caeleb Dressel. He is ridiculous number of medals, 7 Olympic medals. He has 15 World Championship medals in the long course, 6 gold medals in the short course, 2 Pan-Pacific, 1 World Junior medals. He holds world records in the long and short course for the 100 meter butterfly, 50 meter butters, 50 meter freestyle, the butter style, short course, and 100 meter individual medley short course. So Caeleb is, I suppose, a pretty accomplished,
fair to say, prolific
swimmer,
prolific competitor.
Now, as always with these S&C Coaches React, this isn't a direct video for Caeleb to watch, so we are criticizing him and telling him what he needs to do in his training because he looks to be doing okay by himself and with the help of people who are helping him. But it does need to be said because there's always 1 or 2 comments when we do his reactions, if they get big enough, people being like, yeah, you're telling Caeleb what to do, and it's like, calm down buddy, this is for people who don't have elite international coaches like Caeleb does, who need some context around their own training and how we'd approach this. And we're just want to talk about what he's doing in his training. And while we don't really have much context on those actions, it's simply to talk about what it might mean, what you could do with that for yourself, what you might do in your own training. And generally, the trajectory with these is always in the positive direction. We always try and look at the best stuff so we can learn about it. We're not really here to be ragging on the bad stuff. And we do talk if there's something that we don't particularly like. But in general, we're trying to see what the best is. And it's not a hit piece ever on the athletes.
Pew, pew, pew.
Starting off with something, I'll be honest, I was just wildly not expecting. This was completely unexpected. But we have some block cleans, lots of block cleans, and some hang snatches. This 100 kilo hang snatch is no right to be this good whatsoever. So just before we get into why he might be using the Olympic lift variations, the quality of movement on this hang snatch is exceptional, and as you'll see in a minute on the block cleans are exceptionally good. So when it comes to the Olympic lifts, there is fantastic reasons for athletes to use them, and if you can move them with this quality of technique, you're in a fantastic place to get those benefits. So when we're using the Olympic lifts or variations, generally we're not going to see the full snatch from the floor and the full clean and jerk from the floor for athletes. We don't need to do that. What we're doing the Olympic lifts for in the S&C of athletes across a variety of different sports is we're trying to increase our ability to contract our muscles in a very powerful and fast fashion, relax them incredibly quickly, and then recontract them as fast as possible, which is an attribute we need for sport. When we're swimming, we're contracting our body as hard as we can. The faster we can move and the more powerful we can move each one of those strokes, the faster you can swim in theory. And it goes the same for running, for throwing, for boxing, anything like that. If we can increase that contracting and relaxing capacity, we are hopefully going to have a better chance at being better at our sport. Now, obviously, skill-specific aspects of that are, at a different play there. But we're looking at that raw attribute of that contracting and relaxing. The Olympic lifts are a fantastic way of doing that. So if we watch these hang snatches from above the knee, we get a very strong contraction. So in that extension, so as the barbell moves from above his knee into that extension, he's aggressively moving that barbell. He is contracting everything as hard as he possibly can to move that barbell fast, which is one of those attributes we need. So we need that contraction to be quick. And then he has to relax these same contracted muscles. So the leg extensors, the ability to pull that barbell high with the upper body, he needs to relax and reverse those to get underneath the barbell, because if he stays in a contracted position, he can't get under the barbell, and eventually the skill is improved by the Olympic lifts. So he contracts really hard, then he relaxes and gets underneath the barbell into that catch position. Then a contraction happens again in that catch position. So we're getting that cyclic approach, and it's an incredibly useful attribute. It can be done in other ways, like we've talked about, with weighted jumps, plyometrics, and other aspects like that. But when you can do the Olympic lifts like this, this is exactly how you want to do them. Now, I do want to take note, Caeleb is a swimmer. Swimmers are long, they're tall, but even Caeleb isn't bending his arms at contact point. He's doing something that's quite interesting, and I'd wonder if he was coached by someone who was pretty useful at the Olympic lifts, or someone who knew what they're doing, because there is an idea that, well, it's a problem that lifters will encounter. So just Olympic weightlifters who have very long arms, they'll say, do I need to bend my arms to get into the hip? But rather, what we recommend is just simply make contact lower. It's a better trade-off than bending your arms.
I actually think you see a little caveat to that, or you see the little nod to that in the way is the bar set up. So he has one sleeve on the spotter bars, and then he has one side of the barbell on the spotter bars. So he's clearly looking for that wider grip, which if he just had the barbell normally on the spotter bars, he'd struggle to get that wider grip. So he's put the bar slightly off center, gotten his wider grip. It's clearly something he's thinking about.
Now, the second variation we've got is block power cleans, or kind of a deeper power clean here, which is one great aspect of that. So a lot of times when we talk about the athletes using the power clean, and a big issue a lot of people run into, and a big criticism a lot of athletes and coaches will get, is really ugly catch positions, using straps in the power clean in a dangerous fashion. And very often when a weightlifter does a power clean, if they're a skilled weightlifter, they'll be able to catch that into a full squat with absolutely no trouble. So if they miss a power clean, there's no fear. But in an athlete, if we go from a full power clean and it's straight into a miss, we can often bail a barbell. If we're in straps, we can end up in a very dangerous position where we're catching our wrists or we're falling over in a very poor manner. But in this case, there's a couple of different great attributes with this. One, he's just lifting pretty heavy. 140 kilo is probably around that 1.5 times body weight, and which is generally the area we want to see people moving the power clean before you it's not that you don't get the benefits, but the benefits start to diminish when you take into the variable of how hard it is to start getting close to a double body weight power clean, or 1.75 times body weight power clean. So we have a heavy barbell, we have looking like he could squat a little bit deeper if needed, and he's not using straps, which is very, very interesting, and something we'd probably more of fans of than not using straps, rather than using straps more often than not. It's better to err on the side of caution, especially with swimmers. We want to protect our wrists and our arms and our shoulder, and not using straps is a great place to be in. And then we just have some pretty good power clean technique. For a taller athlete like him, the power clean is going to be quite difficult. Technically in the snatch, longer arms could be a better benefit if used correctly, but in the power clean, just being longer overall, as Darryl will know and will probably tell you, it's not a great builds to have for looking for heavy power cleans. So when it comes to the specific technique that he's using, so he's in a safe position in the catch position. He's not using those straps. His elbows are quite high, almost parallel to the floor, which is a great position to be in. He's probably using the hook grip, and if he's not, that's very, very impressive, but it does look like he's using the hook grip. He gets a pretty aggressive, violent extension. Now, does he lean back a little bit too much? Does he throw his head back a little bit too much for a power clean? Yeah, but that's not a major problem. One, if we're getting the weight there. Two, if we're getting the weight and that speed together and we're getting that violent extension and into a catch position, we're kind of getting a lot of the benefits. So sometimes if people are very au fait weightlifting, maybe they're weightlifting coaches or they're weightlifting athletes, and they see the technique athletes use, Olympians or American football players, and they're kind of like getting jimmies a bit Russell, and they're like, that's really bad technique. But in reality, is it that bad? We're looking for an outcome. We're looking for approximate band of specific weights, and we're looking for a safe movement. And while it might not be the most optimal, perfect, best technique that you could use for a block power clean, and could you argue that if you'd better technique, you'd use more weight? Yes, but at the end of the day, athletes they're working. They've got to get stuff done. They've got to do their job. And we could only waste so much time in the gym where we're just kind of wasting time perfecting it. Like, I've been trying to perfect snatch for 12 years. Does Caeleb have 12 years to perfect the power clean? I don't think so.
Absolutely not. So up next we have a trio of fairly interesting exercises to see swimmers doing. So the first one is a drop jump. Now, it's a variation of a drop jump you're probably not all that familiar with, where we have a secondary movement afterwards with a med ball. Then after that, we have some resisted jumping. And then after that, we have some resisted sprinting. So if we look at the drop jump first, what we're doing when we're doing a drop jump, specifically for an athlete, is what we're really looking to do is load up and develop the tendon. So mostly it's their quadriceps tendon, their patellar tendon, their Achilles tendon in their leg. And what they're doing is they're basically dropping from a height. In that way, they have to absorb those ground reaction forces. Then their muscle will contract, loading the tendon even more, and then they'll jump upwards from there. Now, most of the time when we do a drop jump, we measure two things. First thing we measure is the absolute height. So obviously there's a lot more ground reactive force if I drop from 4 meters versus dropping from 40 centimeters. So usually we keep the height pretty low. That's a fairly easy way of mitigating risk or having moderate loads on those tendons. Now, the second thing we tend to do with drop jumps, and in a non-weighted variation particularly, is we try and limit the amount of time they're in contact with the ground with to be as explosive as possible. So imagine I have a spring. If I drop down onto a spring and I want to get the most explosive reaction possible, I'm going to drop down onto that spring and immediately bounce up from there. If I have that spring and I then hold that spring down for longer, if it was a metallic spring undergoing normal physical reactions, that metallic spring would still have a large reaction from there. But in the case of a tendon, and particularly the muscle tendon unit and human physiology, or just organic physiology generally speaking, when I hold down that tendon for longer, what I basically do is I release some of the tension that's in that tendon. That tension bleeds into the muscle will go into a slightly more lengthened position. So imagine my Achilles as being a rope on the end of my calf muscles. When I jump down into that initial landing position, it's just the tendon lengthens. Once I hold that position for a second, some of that length from the tendon will basically bleed in and become length in the muscle itself. Now, it's pretty self-explanatory that the explosion upwards from there is going to be a far slower explosion upwards. Now, the interesting thing about this variation, where we see a med ball being held in the hand and then thrown up immediately afterwards, is firstly, we increase the ground reaction forces. So there's more mass moving downwards. Maybe it's 10 pounds or 15 pounds, whatever that med ball weighs. So I've increased that ground reaction force. But to go on top of that, I've now probably increased the amount of time I'm on the floor for. So it's interesting, in these cases, we get a kind of duality that might somehow cancel itself out. I've increased the amount of tension going into the tendon, which is great. It means I'm getting more of a training stimulus in that tendon. But now I might be on the ground for a bit longer, which might bleed into the muscle a small bit more. And bleed is the wrong word, but dissipate some of that force into the muscle tissues a small bit more. And now I might have less of a training effect on that tendon. Now, in this case, we obviously see Caeleb jumping an incredible height afterwards. It's a large, explosive, triple extension movement afterwards. You obviously want swimmers to be able to turn and hit the wall very explosively. You want them to be able to jump off the blocks and be incredibly explosive. So it makes sense why they're doing this. But in your own training, when we look to bring in a drop jump or something like that, we really want to be very specific with how we divvy up those different variations of the drop jumps. Now, moving on from this, a nice little variation we see here is some weighted jumping. So in the jump communities, right? So triple jumpers, long jumpers, pole vaulters, anyone that needs to jump incredibly high will typically see weighted jumps being held as a negative thing. We don't want to be constraining the jump. We want to be facilitating the jump. And for that reason, we'll see people jumping. Maybe they're jumping with some elastic on them. Maybe they're jumping to a slightly different level when they're landing. All of these things allowing that person to jump higher, stay in the air for longer, and facilitate that muscle adaptation. Now, in the case where we see athletes doing those resisted jumps, there's something very, very different going on here. So a swimmer isn't necessarily worried about what their vertical jump is. That's not their sporting event. But what they're really worried with is having powerful legs and a powerful lower body. So when they're taking off the blocks, or when they're turning and exploding back off the wall, that their legs are able to produce a lot of force very, very quickly. Now, in this case, having something like a weighted jump is a great tool. So a weighted jump is very far along the velocity line in the force velocity curve, but pretty low on the force line. So we've got a movement that I'm still producing quite a lot of force, but it's incredibly fast. And this is something that will put it at odds with, it's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum to something like a maximum deadlift. There's probably periods of that swimmer season where a max deadlift is an absolutely great movement to do. But when they're closer to competition, or when they're really focusing on those particular areas when they need to be fast and need to be explosive, the weighted jump is a great option for them. Now, going hand in hand with that, and a nice little segue from here, is some weighted sprint work. So weighted sprint work with a sled, we'll typically see athletes who are maybe in a field sport doing weighted sprints to get better at that acceleration phase, staying length over, really focusing on that rate of their pace, really focusing on their ability to produce a lot of force, put a lot of force into the ground as quickly as possible. Now, we don't have the context around these training sessions. We don't know if this is off season. We don't know if this is in season. We don't know if they're recovering from something or working on something in particular. But particularly in the case where work capacity is being worked on, those short, sharp, weighted sprints are so valuable. And it's the reason we see all the combat athletes doing weighted sprints or stair sprints or hill sprints. We see it in almost every sport across all the disciplines. These shorter range, more explosive style sprints are just so valuable, not only for our work capacity but also for being explosive, for being powerful as athletes.
So one of the next exercises you'll see is some pull-ups. So we'll see a lot of different swimmers in their S&C doing weighted pull-ups or normal pull-ups, neutral grip pull-ups. And obviously, when it comes to S&C, we are sticking very general when it comes to our strength conditioning. But then there's a certain percentage of S&C that gets mildly specific to that sport. And if we look at swimming, we're looking at lats, posture, obviously being very important. And then if we're looking at our ability to pull through the water, if you watch the stroke, we'll see that the thumb goes down. They'll internally rotate their shoulder and pull it through. The lats are the internal rotators of the shoulder, or one of the muscles involved in that. And it just so happens that pull-ups are very good at training the lats and other areas. So we don't go, okay, we're going to do weighted, weird internal rotation shoulder exercises. We're going to go, okay, what's a better exercise? Pull-ups. Weighted pull-ups are fantastic. We can get moderate to high reps. We can get pretty heavy with them. We can load them appropriately. We can keep them pretty consistent. So among other exercises like barbell rolls or seal rows are very useful. But pull-ups are one of the few exercises that are fantastic for that. So in this case, it's quite interesting because there's a lot of investigation on the practices of elite swimmers and their S&C training. Now, there's no doubt about the impact for strength conditioning and power output, etc. on swimming performance. There's a lot of investigations on that, and upper and lower body strength and power is very important. It explains a lot of people's performances in the gym. And as you see from a lot of elite swimmers, you'll see them taking their S&C pretty seriously. And if you look at the numbers, for example, Caeleb's put it up here in his hang snatch and his power cleans alone will let you know that you just can't really get there by accident unless you're some kind of freak, which, to be fair, Caeleb probably is. But if you look at the investigation, one particular study looked at 95 different national athletes from a variety of different national governing bodies and nations, and the two most common exercises were pull-ups and back squats. Now, we don't have a video of Caeleb back squatting, but as we say, we don't have a full remit of S&C, we just have a select few exercises that we see here. Now, the last thing I would like to touch on is something that we talk about very repeatedly, and it's something that comes up quite a lot when we look at these athletes, and that is Caeleb's body composition. So this is something that it is very important. It's a hard balance to find. It's a very personal number for you, as in the exact numbers are something that are quite individual, and what kind of power you can do, what kind of strength you can have, what kind of body mass you can have, what kind of body fat you can have, and mixing all these in for the best body composition for you is something that can't be made a general recommendation in terms of specific numbers. But we can make a general recommendation in the fact that generally less body fat is better and generally more muscle mass is better, but it's not always the case that more absolute mass is better. So obviously for a swimmer, we want extreme power to weight ratio capacity, so we want to be as powerful as possible and be able to move through that water in good posture, in a good position, but we don't want to be dragging a heavy body that doesn't need to be there. So fat mass in the water, while might add some buoyancy, in regards to speed events, is probably not going to be a great benefit. We're not swimming around Great Britain, for example, like Ross Edgley might, who intentionally gained weight. When we're looking for speed events here in swimming, these are still quite short events, so that streamlined body, lower mass, less excess, bulges, maybe some love handles wouldn't be the best.
Some tight swimming trunks.
Yeah.
In my opinion, swimmer's body type isn't overly different from any other sport. I think, to be honest, the least different for any other sport is in terms of their body composition, and they hold a lot of muscle mass. One interesting caveat to the swimmers is the torso length compared to leg length. So obviously our legs, very important in terms of propulsion, very important in terms of the turn, the start, all of that stuff. But we want the legs to be short and not drooping down in the water below us. So you'll see guys like Michael Phelps, massive long torsos, very short legs. They'll typically have legs of people who are at least a foot shorter than them on average. So that's the most interesting thing here for me. The length of their arms, the length of their torso tends to be a massive defining factor, or a major kind of point of talent ID with swimmers, rather than the kind of amazing physique they tend to hold. In most professional sports, athletes are in incredible nick all the time.
Yeah, and Caeleb is absolutely no different. Certainly, possibly even one of the more jacked swimmers in terms of body composition, and he is, one of the best, so it definitely plays into that. So thanks for watching today's S&C Coaches React. Remember, check out our app, Sika Strength app on iOS and Android for strength training. Maybe you need a power clean program. Maybe you need a squat program. They are there in the app, incredibly successful. The squat program, for example, the RTA has been run literally thousands of times. So do check those out on the Sika Strength app on iOS and Android. If you have any athletes you would like us to look at, please do let us know in the comments below. There's a big list, an Excel full of athletes that we've picked up from people commenting. So if they have sufficient training footage somewhere on YouTube or on social media, and if we can look at it and you give us their name, you leave it below and we'll go have a look at it and add it to that list. So thank you very much for everyone who does contribute to that, as it does make our job a little bit easier. Bulges,